Yeah, we're going to be talking about the legacy of Syd Barrett and the Pink Floyd for this special issue of Sound Opinions. We were going to do one whole album, but we were fighting for a couple of weeks between you and me and Matt Spiegel, our intrepid producer. We couldn't decide which Floyd album, so this way we get to taste all of them.
Exactly.
Some call it free sound. Others prefer to include it in the psychedelic wave of isms already circulating around the Western Hemisphere. But this music, here and now, is that of the Pink Floyd, a group of 4 young musicians, a light man, and an array of equipment sadistically designed to shatter the strongest nerves. The Pink Floyd are new on the London scene. They've stupefied audiences at all-night raves, in church halls, at the Albert Hall, and on various tours in Britain. They've yet to make their debut on records.
Ah, the drama. You gotta love it. That's Astronomy Domain from the very first Pink Floyd album called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It came out.
It's Domine. Did you catch that? Now, that was some interesting audio that Matt Spiegel found of the Canadian Broadcasting Company talking about Pink Floyd in 67, shortly before the release of Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is the band's first album. Did you catch what she said? They've stupefied audiences at all-night raves.
Right.
I love that.
The first rave band.
I'd never heard that clip, and that of course was the thesis of one of my first book, was that you can draw a line from the psychedelic freakouts of the mid '60s with bands like Pink Floyd to the rave scene of the new millennium. You know, that this desire to get outside your head and to dance all night to crazy loud music with tripping lights.
Right.
You know, runs throughout rock history. And one of the key bands that has brought that sound forward has been the Pink Floyd. So we're talking about the first incarnation of the band. I can use the. They dropped it after the first album. Right. Initially, they were the Pink Floyd, and they came together. It was 4 English art school students, architecture and art school, upper middle class. These were not.
They were not.
These were not working class heroes.
They were not pretend bohemians like the Rolling Stones or even the Beatles to a degree.
Yeah,
sort of like. Worked up the working class aspects of
these were cultured
background.
Young lads. Their dads were doctors, their dads were architects, they had some money, they had enough money to get into good schools, and they had ambition. And they came after the Beatles. I mean, they were inspired by the early Beatles, but they started doing something, and the Stones started doing something very different. Initially started very much like the Stones as a kind of R&B, pub band, and that didn't last long at all. Shortly thereafter got to this territory.
Right. Consider when this album came out, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, came out in August of 67. That was only a couple of months after Sgt. Pepper.
It was recorded at Abbey Road
right
at the
next
same
door.
time as Pepper. They were doing it next door.
And they used their engineer, the producer, Norman Smith, had worked with George Martin on a lot of the Beatles records. So they were using basically, kind of the same ideas and the same recording studio and the same equipment that the Beatles were. But they were taking it, I think, a step further. If you listen to what Sgt. Pepper was doing, I think where Sgt. Pepper left off is where The Piper at the Gates of Dawn took off.
Oh, it's a better album.
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely. It's a masterpiece, and it's a much better album. Not a better album than Revolver, but certainly than Pepper's. So what we want to do...
and Matt Spiegel...
You can't argue with that.
Wait a minute.
I had to make sure we didn't let that pass.
You
this is a better album than Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah, The Piper
Absolutely.
at the Gates of Dawn is one of the classic masterpieces. It's a masterpiece. And
it's
I wouldn't say that
album.
about,
it's a perfect album.
About Pepper. Astronomy Domine. Now I've got it right. What we're hearing at the very start of that song, wind it back to the very top of that song. Let's hear it again. What we're hearing here is the band's manager, a fellow by the name of Peter Jenner, who now I believe works with Billy Bragg, of all people.
Yeah.
I think he's
and
a manager
managed
of
Robert Hitchcock as well.
Yes, and he has what he's reciting here is stars and galaxies in the background while the music sort of starts percolating in underneath. Here's the news, ladies and gentlemen. Space rock is born. Space rock is born. The Pink Floyd, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
Well, clearly, at the same time, at the same place, literally, right next door to the Beatles, they're using the same idea that the Beatles had had reached. The combination of technology, the recording studio had suddenly become 4 tracks.
Right.
So you could do multiple overdubs. You could create these soundscapes that necessarily couldn't be reproduced live in a concert setting. Right. And so, certainly the Floyd and the Beatles weren't the only people doing this, but they had a lot of money, and the Floyd was signed, to Virgin, and there was a push behind them, and they had the freedom to indulge themselves. They weren't quite doing the stuff that the Beatles were doing, but they obviously were taking their time and doing overdubs and experimenting, and you have these layered kind of explorations of different sounds, of outer space.
Well, a good example of that. Yeah, exactly. Interstellar Overdrive. We got that right there. This is basically 2 versions of the song lapped on top of each other.
Right.
Basically overlaid on top. So you can sort of hear the density that they were sort of shooting for, and the fact that, obviously they weren't going to be able to reproduce this live, but this is what they sounded like in the studio.
But see, they were actually able to reproduce that stuff live.
Well, they were, but basically the only thing that stayed constant here was that riff.
Right.
Syd Barrett's guitar riff at the very top of the song. The middle section just completely blew out wherever they wanted to take it. And then, 45 minutes later, Syd would play that riff again, which was basically the signal to the band that, okay,
go back.
We're back, we're done.
The Yardbirds had taken R&B into this direction of rave-ups, with a series of 3 great guitars, Clapton to Beck to Page. And keeping a more or less strict R&B rhythm section going, they would go out off into these experimental terrains of jamming, rave it up and then bring it back. And so clearly Pink Floyd was picking that up, but then slowly subtracting all the blues.
Right, right.
I mean, Nick Mason is a wonderfully ham-fisted drummer, and we have to talk more about him as it goes, because my personal theory about why the Floyd is so great is because you always had Mason, who they were spinning off into outer space, but Mason always kept it grounded, and that's why it's rock and roll. It's always great rock and roll. It always rocks hard, even as they're shooting off in 10 different directions.
Right.
So they were able to do this stuff live, very much like the Yardbirds were, but they added these extra elements of lights, of flashing, multimedia stuff, and from the beginning, the Floyd was very much about a show.
One thing that's interesting about the Piper at the Gates of Dawn that's also different from subsequent Pink Floyd records, and I think we're going to set up, Jim and I are going to talk about this dichotomy as we go throughout the evening, but Syd Barrett's songwriting is different from Roger Waters' songwriting. Roger Waters became the dominant songwriter, obviously, in the Floyd as the years progressed. Syd Barrett, though, it was clearly Syd Barrett's band with the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, with Roger Waters essentially as the bass player.
How much do you have to think? We're going to explain, and we're going to drop this name, Syd Barrett. We're going to kind of look at how he touched on every era of the Floyd. But we're starting, obviously, with the first album, and this is Syd's album, as you just said. How much do you think we have to explain to people who Syd Barrett was? Are people even aware that there were Pink Floyd albums before Dark Side of the Moon?
I don't think so. I think the vast majority of people think that Pink Floyd is basically Dark Side of the Moon onward, and the knowledge about Pink Floyd prior to that is pretty limited. Obviously, the Floydophiles out there, have all those albums plus the B-sides and all the and the Syd Barrett bootlegs which are available.
Well, so we have to ask the Floydophiles to forgive us a little bit because we want to kind of trace the Syd story for those who don't know. Obviously, the band was essentially built around this guy, Syd Barrett, Roger Syd Barrett. He went by Syd and let the bass player keep Roger. Yeah. And there were 2 kinds of songwriting going on. There was, as we just heard, Astronomy Domine and Interstellar Overdrive, these kind of outer space explorations. But his real passion was in this kind of gnomes and fairy tale English psychedelia. There's this ancient tradition in England of kind of whimsy, a woodsy, idyllic whimsy. It is the nation, after all, that gave us all those great fairy tales. Right. And, there's songs on this first album like The Gnome, which was a loving portrait of a gnome.
Yes.
And Lucifer Sam, which is a really interesting song about a witch's cat. And so Barrett, is kind of in the tradition. The title of the album comes from Wind in the Willows,
right? Mr.
Toad and Mr. Who is it? Mr. Rat and Mr. Mole and Mr. Toad, right? Yeah. It comes from Piper at the Gates of Dawn comes from a chapter title in that children's story. So this kind of whimsy permeates the whole record. along with the outer space kind of cold stellar edge.
It's a profound Englishness that I think Waters, even though obviously this is obviously a quintessentially English British band, it was never more pronounced than when Barrett was in it. To me, right now, you hear an artist like Robin Hitchcock, and Robin Hitchcock is a guy who exemplifies exactly what, to understand what I'm talking about Syd Barrett, listen to any Robin Hitchcock record today. Yeah. There's an Englishness about it. The track Jim and I want to play for you tonight to sort of illustrate what Syd Barrett's all about, and you could play any number of tracks off the Piper of the Gates of Dawn. But we want to go to Lucifer Sam, but first let's take a listen to what Roger Waters was up to at the same time, just to illustrate the difference.
So Waters, who became the band's
main songwriter,
but he only had one contribution on the